Welcome. Today, after a few weeks of cutting through hordes of Tyranids and clashing with Chaos Marines, I'll be taking the time to talk about Space Marine 2. Now, I know what you're thinking. A Space Marine review after this many weeks of release. Is it even worth talking about at this point? But I wanted to give the game time to sink in, after all the initial hype had died down, and look at it with some perspective. First off, let's address the Carnifex in the room. There's been some chatter about the game's lack of diversity, and even suggestions of an anti-woke agenda. But honestly, I didn't really see a problem. For what the game is, a power fantasy in the Warhammer 40k universe, I felt it stayed true to the source material. I'm not exactly a 40k lore buff or anything, but not every game needs to follow the diversity checklist just to tick boxes, especially when the source lore is grim, dark, and full of giant armored men who get their kicks by burning Xenos and purging heretics in the name of their god emperor. So let's talk gameplay. I started the game thinking I was going to stomp everything in my path. After all, you're a Space Marine, an 8-foot tall, power armor wearing Hulk with a chainsword and a bolter. But after getting smacked around by waves of Tyranids, I found myself adjusting the difficulty just a notch. I'll be honest, the game felt a little clunky at first. I wasn't really getting that power fantasy you'd expect from a Space Marine, and honestly, I felt like I was struggling more than I should have been. I wanted to feel powerful, mowing down hordes of enemies with a bolter and a chainsword, and it wasn't until I lowered the difficulty just a tad that things started to feel right. Only then did I really start to experience that unstoppable super soldier feeling that the game promises. Let's talk pacing. Space Marine 2 throws you into a constant cycle of combat, and while it's great fun, it can feel a tad repetitive. For the first half of the game, you're cutting through hordes of Tyranids. The dodge and parry mechanics are fun, but after about the 100th time, it can start to feel a little stale. But that's where the pacing works in the game's favour. Just when the combat feels like it's wearing thin, the game introduces a new story beat, boss fight, bigger, badder enemy, and it shakes things up, offering a new enemy type and new strategies, keeps the action from coming too monotonous. In fact, the pacing in general is fantastic in my opinion, with the story ramping up and introducing the forces of chaos at just the right time to keep me wanting more. There are some moments, like the Lictor boss fight, that feel a bit abrupt or underwhelming, but overall the pacing does a decent job of keeping you invested in the action, even when the combat loop starts to feel a little bit samey. And while the story wasn't exactly groundbreaking, it keeps things moving enough to keep you interested and acts as the perfect vehicle for the action of combat.
Major Salgana, what's your status?
We've lost a lot of men, a lot of heavy rounds, but we're still in the fight!
We're coming to you now. Nozick, when they hit, Lirio, do you read?
So let's discuss the story a little. The story of Space Marine 2 is exactly what you'd expect from a game set in the Warhammer 40k universe. Big, loud, and with enough grimdark atmosphere to make any 40k fan happy. You play as Lieutenant Titus from the first game, a battle-hardened Space Marine once again fighting to save the Imperium of Man. While it sticks closely to the 40k's usual grimdark themes, I have to say that if you're not deeply familiar with the 40k universe, the story can feel a little bit confusing at times. There's not a lot of hand-holding when it comes to explaining the lore. You get thrown into this massive conflict with Tyranids, Chaos Space Marines, and references to the God Emperor and the Imperium, but if you don't already know the significance of these things, it can feel a bit overwhelming. The game doesn't do much to fill in the blanks for new players. It kind of assumes you already know a good deal about 40k lore. And as someone who's not a hardcore lore buff, I found myself just kind of going with the flow. For example, I had no idea what the Death Watch were as shown in the first part of the game, but a brief Google later and I was all caught up. but I can see how it might be hard for newcomers to the franchise to fully grasp what's going on. With that said, you don't really need to know all of the details in order to enjoy the action. Just be ready for some terms and concepts that might fly over your head. Here, for example, you can see the Lord of Change, a greater demon of Tzeentch, being assaulted by a battalion of Ultramarines. The Lord of Change is the embodiment of deception and knowledge, and seeing one of these massive reality-warping demons is awesome. Is it important to know the deep underpinning lore of Chaos and Tzeentch to enjoy this moment? Honestly, I don't think so. Sure, understanding the lore adds a whole other layer of depth, but even if you had no idea what Tzeentch is or why this giant bird-like demon is here, you can still appreciate how epic this scene is. Now, like I said, the introduction of the Chaos Space Marines does give the story a bit more depth. As I mentioned earlier, the Tyranids can get a bit tiresome. It's a solid twist that throws another layer of conflict into the mix. But again, for anyone unfamiliar with the rich lore behind the Chaos Marines, and especially the faction on display here, the Thousand Sons, their sudden and pretty strange appearance might leave you scratching your head. The final act builds to an epic confrontation, but like the rest of the game, it doesn't overstay its welcome. Even if the plot is fairly straightforward, it wraps up in a way that will satisfy most players, while leaving the potential for a continuation with future DLC. With all of that said, Space Marine 2 isn't the longest game out there. In fact, I found it to be pretty short. I managed to complete the single-player campaign in about 9 hours, although your mileage may vary. But to its credit, as I said, it doesn't overstay its welcome, and some games do simply drag on for the sake of padding runtime, which is definitely not the case here. It feels concise, almost like the single-player campaign is meant to be a long build-up for the multiplayer operations and the Eternal War modes. Talking of operations mode does feel like a natural extension to the campaign. Playing with 2 other players or AI squad mates, you complete missions adjacent to the story mode, such as running distraction operations while Titus and his squad complete the main objective. This game mode pushes you to work together, especially on the higher difficulties, and I never felt like either a spare part or that I carried a team. There's also a decent level of customization here, letting you choose your loadout and adapt to different situations. It's a nice touch that adds a bit more depth to the mode, especially if you're looking for something more tactical after having completed the campaign. If you enjoyed the co-op aspects of the campaign, you'll definitely find a lot to like in operations mode. It's chaotic in the best way possible, and it's clear that the game was designed with this multiplayer experience in mind as the long-term draw. As for PvP, Space Marine 2 also has you covered on that front for players who want a more competitive edge. I'll admit though, I'm not a huge fan of PvP in general. I can't think why.
Khorne needs more skulls!
While I've never been a huge fan of competitive PvP shooters, especially since the Modern Warfare days, you'll get to face off against other players in tactical squad-based PvP. And while that's not for me, I can definitely see the appeal for fans of fast-paced tactical combat. Overall, the multiplayer side of Space Marine 2 adds a lot of replayability to the game. Whether you're jumping into operations mode for co-op chaos, or trying your hand at PvP, there's something here to keep you busy long after the campaign ends.
Rise, son of Guilliman.
So that's it. Those are my thoughts on Space Marine 2. Do I recommend it? Is Space Marine 2 worth your time and your money? If you're a fan of the Warhammer 40k universe, absolutely. It's a short, tight, fast-paced campaign with some satisfying combat and a narrative that's true to the source material. If you're new to the 40k franchise, I still recommend it, but just bear in mind what I said earlier about the story beats. And with added multiplayer modes, both PvE and PvP, the game offers plenty of ways to keep you coming back. With all that said, thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed hearing my thoughts on the game, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to ABerryPlays for more content. I'd also love to hear your thoughts about Space Marine 2 in the comments. Until next time.
For the Emperor! For the Emperor!